Welcome to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vitor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Happy New Year, buddy.
I mean, it feels like it's been forever, man.
It has been very, very long. It's been a million years.
It's been a sabbatical, I think.
Yeah, we went on sabbatical.
Yeah.
You have a good break?
Yeah, went to New York.
Nice.
A lot of kid activities. When you have kids, you have a great time, but you are more tired at the end of the break than you were at the beginning.
So tired. Hannah got the stomach flu like 36 hours into our Christmas break, and so there's a lot of
it's dark.
Chasing kids one-on-one.
It's dark.
Not ideal, but it's great to be back. Just got back from Iowa. That was fun.
It's that time of year, or that time of every 4 years.
That time of that time. It's weird, man. It's the same places, it's the same events, same reporters. But
Except it doesn't matter.
Content was very dark.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter, and the content
it was
is
this
very
incredibly
dark.
hopeful thing for us, and now it's not.
Yeah, we think about it with the most rose-colored glasses, this incredible year-long effort to build a grassroots organization that really brought in new people and empowered folks. And then I get out there and it's like January 6th was an inside job and more.
I think the craziest thing to me is that Obama crushed Iowa twice in the general election, right? So,
I know.
Which is impossible. It's not a swing state anymore.
No, it's very conservative.
It just shows you, some of that I'd credit to Obama, but a lot of that I put on the information system. All those people that, we were trying to reach when you were the spokesman in Iowa were reading local newspapers.
Exactly.
And now they're all just living in some weird information system.
Facebook algorithm. But very happy to be back talking worldo stuff. We're going to cover the latest from Israel and Gaza, the changing politics of the war within the Democratic Party, and this scary risk of regional escalation. We're also going to talk about this odd saga of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's medical issues and secret absence. And then there's a couple important updates on foreign corruption in U.S. politics that we wanted to talk about, the latest from Russia and Ukraine, political violence in South Korea, and then a couple quick updates from Germany and France. And then, Ben, you're doing our interview this week. What are we going to hear about?
Yeah, well, Saturday is the most important election that you might not be following. It's the Taiwan election. And so we're going to be talking to Emily Wu, who's been on this podcast before and also was a key character and voice in a story I wrote on Taiwan for The Atlantic about what are the stakes in this election, who are the candidates, what does this mean for potential tensions or even conflict with China, what's the role of the U.S. in all this. So check it out for a really good preview of the election in Taiwan with a very cool and compelling podcaster.
I was going to say, you buried the lead, right?
Yeah,
Ghost Island Media?
Ghost Island Media. Emily runs a podcast company. Ghost Island Media has a podcast called Taiwan Takes that offers takes
Hot
from
takes
Taiwan.
on Taiwan.
Yeah, it's good.
No, she's really smart. I think I interviewed her last time.
You did.
And really enjoyed that. She's very smart and thoughtful, and I learned a lot. Okay, Ben, well, let's turn to Gaza because sadly, we've been gone for a while, but the war is still raging there more than 3 months after the Hamas terrorist attack that killed more than 1,200 people, and more than 100 people are still being held hostage in Gaza. So some grim statistics about the fighting in Gaza from a New York Times report on Tuesday. About 23,000 Gazans have been killed in this Israeli military campaign. That's roughly 1% of the total population of Gaza. The UN says that more than 80% of Gaza residents have been displaced, and 60% of the buildings there have been damaged, which is all just raising the question of when the war ends, what do people have to go home to, if they go home at all? The Israeli Defense Forces say they have destroyed much of Hamas's military infrastructure, including ammo depots, rocket production facilities, and parts of their underground tunnel network. The IDF also claims to have killed 9,000 Hamas fighters. But the humanitarian situation on the ground is, by all accounts, just a nightmare. Here's a clip from a surgeon named Nick Maynard, who works with the organization Medical Aid for Palestinians. Nick was on the ground in Gaza providing medical treatment for sick and wounded people until Sunday, when he had to be pulled out due to risks from increasing Israeli military activities.
The reality on the ground here is completely different, or much worse, should I say, than we were able to get from the media and even from talking to people on the ground when we were back in the UK. It is much, much worse. And you can't really appreciate the huge overcrowding and the permanent security risks unless you actually witness it all. The hospitals are in excess of 4 or 5 times their normal capacity. Every single square foot of ground is occupied by patients or their relatives. You walk into the hospital and seeing people outside with chest drains in, with surgical drains in, with nasty infected wounds. The admissions per day often exceeds well over 100. And today there were very few members of the surgical team, leaving much of the work to me and Khaled. We're seeing many blast injuries and increasing numbers of abdominal and thoracic injuries compared to when we first got here. And we fear it will only get worse.
Sorry about that buzzing in the background. It was a drone over him, as happens in a war zone. So, Ben, Secretary of State Tony Blinken is in Israel today. He is reportedly pushing Israeli leaders to do more to limit civilian casualties, avoid a broader war with Hezbollah, and do some post-war planning. Israel says they are transitioning to a new phase in the war, one with fewer airstrikes, lower intensity combat, and fewer Israeli troops deployed in Gaza. I don't know that we've seen much evidence of reduced airstrikes, but we have seen reduced troop levels, which happened in part because the Israeli economy was suffering because of labor shortages, because so many reservists were called up. So, Ben, we want to get into these the regional escalation issues next. But in terms of the war itself, like, so much happened when we were gone. There were reports about failures by the IDF on October 7th. The Washington Post reviewed evidence or what does and does not exist of Hamas infrastructure at the Al-Shifa hospital. There's reports of growing tensions between the U.S., between Biden and Netanyahu, and the feeling that, extreme parts of the Netanyahu coalition are actually running things. But maybe the biggest rift is over what comes next, because you have right-wing ministers like Itamar Ben-Gvir openly calling for the government to, quote-unquote, encourage residents of Gaza to emigrate, which, for the record, would be ethnic cleansing. But the United States wants the Palestinian Authority to be in charge of Gaza and for no one to be forced to leave, and for the right of return for anyone who has. And, residents of Gaza will likely hate both of those ideas. So I guess what I'm getting at, Ben, is I just wonder if it's possible for the U.S. and Israel to even be on the same page if this current Israeli governing coalition remains in charge.
Yeah, I think the short answer to that question is no, there's not any possibility to be on the same page. I mean, it's been 3 weeks. We can't possibly do justice to everything that's taken place. I just, part of this, Tommy, is you begin to run out of words to describe the gravity of the humanitarian crisis. Yep. I mean, when you hear that report about the hospital that we played, the first thing I'd say is that people that I know or people that I trust as very credible, people who work in international aid, people who've been in conflict after conflict after conflict. And these are not people that kind of single out Israel for criticism. These are just people that are in international humanitarian aid work, right? You hear them say they've never seen anything like this, and these are people that have been in Syria, they've been in Libya, they've been in Yemen. This scale and pace at which this is unfolded is just, it's new.
You hear there's a military analyst too.
Yeah.
About how there's just an unprecedented volume of airstrikes. You're seeing years worth of airstrikes in Afghanistan or Iraq happening in months.
Yeah. 10,000 children killed in 3 months is an astonishing number. It just, and that's what happens. And these are U.S. bombs, 2,000-pound bombs, huge airstrikes. That's why the scale is so big. That the amount of firepower and the pace of it in this densely populated area is just leading to unprecedented human suffering, and that has to be front and center in mind, coupled with this kind of siege approach of cutting off food and limiting aid and water. In terms of the Biden approach, that is basically the same with a dial turning up. It's still, we support Israel's military operation, but we want them to avoid civilian casualties and let more aid in. That is not working and is never going to work with this government. And that's the key point. This government, Netanyahu, you see him looking over at the right wing of his coalition, who is calling, this isn't just something we're surmising. They are calling for the mass displacement of people in Gaza. They're calling for more airstrikes on civilian areas. They're calling for essentially flattening the Gaza Strip and dislocating those people out of the out of the area. And those are the people that Netanyahu is looking towards and worried about. And even with this recalibration in the Israeli messaging, where they're saying publicly that to the international community, like we're becoming more targeted, and hopefully that is the case in some respect, they're saying something different to their own population. Mm-hmm. They're saying to their own population, no, we're going to continue this as long as it takes. They're even saying like, well, sometimes we have to say this to the international community. Yeah. That's the nature of this government. And so I think what needs to change here is not saying like we urge this government not to do this. First of all, we shouldn't be the ones doing it. Netanyahu should be the one saying that we're not going to displace people in Gaza, The U.S. has to be saying we will not provide assistance to a government that has as its policy the displacement of Palestinians from Gaza. We will not provide assistance to a government that envisions an open-ended Israeli reoccupation of Gaza. That's not good for Israel's security. That's not obviously good for the people of Gaza. There has to be a shift in calibration away from trying to convince this Israeli government to be something that it's not. I mean, even saw today Tony Blinken saying, Saudi normalization remains on the table as long as the goal is a Palestinian state. This Israeli government's policy is for there to not be a Palestinian state. So there's this enormous discordance between the U.S. urging this government to do something that they have said that they will not do. And so either I don't believe that Netanyahu is going to change colors or that Ben Gvir is suddenly going to be for a Palestinian state. This government needs to change or U.S. policy needs to change.
Yeah, I think that's our leverage.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing else.
That should have been the leverage from day one, probably, is to say, hey, Bibi, we will get your back, but first you got to get rid of Smotrich. You got to get rid of Itamar Ben Gvir, these like extreme right-wing ministers in your government. And then now it sounds, based on reports in places like Politico, the U.S. government fears are the ones really leading Netanyahu around.
Yeah, because they're his political security blanket.
Yeah.
They're the people that agreed to this deal to give him immunity from criminal prosecution, right? So long as he gave them everything they wanted. And until that dynamic changes, yes, this may be on a pathway towards some more targeted effort, but the damage is already done. I mean, there could be a ceasefire today, as there should be. And it's not like that would have saved as many lives as there should have been saved here. And by the way, as we've said time and again, and we should say again, like I don't think that's good for Israel. I think they are radicalizing Palestinians. I think that they are creating humanitarian crisis. I think they're inviting, obviously, we keep seeing the U.S. media is behind this. We keep seeing, the international public opinion is beginning to turn against Israel. Well, that was like 6 weeks ago, guys. Yeah. Like, there's just a kind of weird time lag to how this is being addressed and talked about. And you're right, though, like where the real difference widens continues to be on what the future is of Gaza, because the U.S. position is that it should be under the administration of the Palestinian Authority with some amount of Arab assistance from the region. The Israeli government has kind of shaded their position a bit, but basically it's still this idea that they're going to have de facto control over Gaza for an open-ended period of time. And I don't know how you square those two things.
Yeah, and by the way, the people in Gaza probably don't want the Palestinian Authority in charge either. I mean, both of those options sound terrible to them because Fatah was in charge in Gaza for many years, and people hated them because of rampant corruption and other abuses. But I agree with you. I think everyone expected and understood that Israel was going to have a military and intelligence response after October 7th to take out Hamas's leadership. But the scale of the destruction, the scale of the civilian casualties has become a humanitarian and a moral and strategic disaster. And I think, it's really hard to watch. But
and just one other thing, you should have some effort, and it may be almost too late because the population of Gaza is probably not wanting to talk to the United States. But you need to have some, to your point, does anybody in Gaza get consulted
Who's at the
about
table from Gaza?
Like I get that Hamas should not be at the table. Sure, we can all agree on that. But
it has to be civil society.
There has to be somebody in Gaza that you're in court. It can't just be like an 87-year-old man, Mahmoud Abbas, in Ramallah, and some Americans and some Israelis decide, like, there has to be some voice for these people in Gaza about their own future.
Yeah. Pod Save the World is brought to you by Delete Me. How would you like to wake up and discover your bank account has been emptied? Not much. Or worse, you don't realize how much of your information is available to scammers on the internet and how susceptible you and your family are to identity theft and fraud. But now you can get your data removed with Delete Me. Delete Me finds and removes any personal information you don't want online and makes sure it stays off. Sign up and provide Delete Me with exactly what information you want deleted, and their experts take it from there. And Delete Me isn't just a one-time service. Delete Me is always working for you, constantly monitoring and removing the personal information you don't want on the internet. I think we've all woken up to the fact that apps or social media sites that we thought were free were actually just harvesting our identity, and we're not thrilled about that. It can lead to identity theft, it can lead to spam, and it can just be kind of unnerving to have all that information online. That's why Delete Me is such a great product and so important for people who want to take back their privacy. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me now at a special discount for our listeners. Today, get 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/world and use promo code WORLD at checkout. The only way to get 20% off is to go to joindeleteme.com/world and enter code WORLD at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/world, code WORLD. Pod Save the World is brought to you by Rocket Money. I think we've all have signed up for something and then realized 6 months, a year, maybe several years later that we're still paying for a service, a streaming site, a magazine, a website, something that we've not looked at in ages. Do you ever feel like money is just flying out of your account and have no idea where it's going? Well, I know it's probably all of those subscriptions. Think about it. Between streaming sites, fitness apps, delivery services, parenting apps, the list is endless. Well, Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has helped save its members an average of $720 a year with over $500 million in canceled subscriptions. I can see all of my subscriptions in one place, and if I see something I don't want, I can cancel it with a tap. You never have to go to the phone or deal with customer service. They'll even try to get you a refund for the last couple months of wasted money and negotiate to lower your bills for you by up to 20%. All you have to do is take a picture of your bill, and Rocket Money takes care of the rest. Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/world. I mean, you're right. I think the coverage has been behind where public opinion is. I also think the political debate in the U.S. is shifting. At first, it was slow, but now it's moving pretty rapidly, especially within the Democratic Party. Here's a clip of Senator Bernie Sanders speaking on the Senate floor about Gaza on December 21st.
While it is appropriate to support defensive systems like Iron Dome to protect Israeli civilians against incoming rockets, it would be irresponsible to provide an additional $10.1 billion in military aid beyond those defensive systems as contained in the proposed supplemental foreign aid package. Bottom line, we should not be giving more money to a right-wing extremist government in Israel to conduct a horrific and immoral military campaign, which includes indiscriminate bombardment. Second, in my view, the United States should support efforts at the United Nations Security Council to end the bloodshed.
So look, I don't currently think that there's the votes for conditioning U.S. assistance to Israel if more assistance gets passed, but it was really good to hear Bernie lay out those principles. And also, I do think it's important to know that there's been a lot of reporting about how the IDF has been using U.S.-provided weapons. And by the way, the State Department over the break went around Congress twice to provide more the artillery shells and other things, tank rounds, for what were deemed to be emergency situations. But I think it was the Washington Post had a big report about how the IDF keeps using American-made 2,000-pound dumb bombs in urban areas, leading to enormous civilian deaths.
Yeah, and why is that? Bernie put it very well. And Bernie, we should be clear, like, is someone who's taken a lot of grief from a lot of his supporters because he didn't call for a ceasefire. So it's not like Bernie's been like way to the left on this thing from the beginning. He's basing what he's saying off of what he's seeing. Yeah. And it's hard to argue with anything he's saying. Like, this is a government that is a far-right extremist government that is conducting a military operation that is clearly indiscriminately killing civilians. And the message sent to the world from the U.S. giving, Iron Dome, I agree with them about. I have friends in Israel. The rockets are coming in. Like, defending Israeli citizens against rocket fire is something that is entirely appropriate, defensible. But providing them with what do you think those tank rounds and ammunition are for? What do you think those 2,000-pound bombs are for? And the message sent to the world, if we provide that kind of aid package, is pretty chilling. I wanted to mention the Al-Shifa hospital thing because it does speak to how the U.S. has been involved in some of this stuff. That Washington Post report did not find what Israel said, about there being some Hamas command center there.
Yeah, like a Pentagon-style command center.
The U.S. government said that it had intelligence supporting what Israel said and never provided that intelligence. And by the way, the U.S. has been willing to provide all kinds of intelligence publicly before when it's about, what Russia's doing in Ukraine, or even about some of these Hamas things, like the
errant rocket
the errant rocket,
blew up
right?
in the hospital, yeah.
It was conspicuous that didn't come out. So we may not want to feel like we are the United States of America co-authors of this Israeli military operation, but the more we provide emergency assistance, and certainly if we spend $10 billion in offensive weaponry for a country, by the way, that can afford it itself, Israel, that sends a message of where we are. And so Bernie's right from both a strategic and a moral perspective.
I mean, and look, to your point earlier, the global debate about what's happening in Gaza is incredibly different than what's the debate in the U.S. On Thursday, the International Court of Justice will hold its first hearings in South Africa's lawsuit accusing Israel of genocide. South Africa is arguing that Israel violated the 1948 Genocide Convention. The 57-member Organization of Islamic Countries is supporting South Africa's effort, as is Turkey, Jordan, Bolivia. The White House has called the case meritless, counterproductive, and completely without basis. So I'm not weighing in one way or the other. I'm just saying, this is what's happening in a lot of the global South, is this conversation we're seeing out of South Africa. And then, by the way, Ben, last week, Israel's Supreme Court struck down Netanyahu's attempt to reduce their power. The listeners might remember we spent months and months talking about Netanyahu's quote-unquote judicial coup efforts. This was, his efforts to weaken the judiciary and give the government, his ruling coalition, more power over the courts. It led to months and months of protests. This ruling would have been a seismic event before October 7th because Netanyahu basically said, I'm going to ignore the court's rulings if they rule against me, and would have created a constitutional crisis. But instead, the country just kind of shrugged it off because everyone's solely focused on what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah. And, but I think it also points to something Bernie said, which is we all thought, including a lot of mainstream people in this country, were alarmed by the constitutional changes, and the government didn't change from then to now. It's the same government, just as extremist, just as anti-democratic.
Probably more emboldened.
Which is, again, another reason why we should be questioning whether the right policy is to hug this government and offer advice to them in private and then give them billions, if not tens of billions of dollars in assistance. There's going to be, Israel is in a crisis of identity in terms of, do they want to continue to be a democracy? And there are people in the Israeli government who don't want it to continue to be a democracy. And I think what we're seeing is that is tied not just to the nature of its domestic policy and legal structure, but it's the same people that are making this military operation or pushing for it to be more extremist, or West Bank policies that are more extremist. The same, it's very overlapping Venn diagram here of people that want to change the nature of Israel inside of Israel to not being democratic, to also wanting to be more pugilistic in Gaza and the West Bank. And those are the people we shouldn't be supporting. Is the bottom line here.
Yes. And frankly, people we weren't supporting several months ago. Biden, remember, famously refused to meet with Netanyahu at the White House for a while because his coalition was so extreme. So stepping back a bit, the risks of this escalating into a larger regional conflict are everywhere. So the pieces of the escalation risk start with the Houthi rebels who are based in Yemen, who continue to fire missiles at ships in the Red Sea. In late December, U.S. Navy helicopters directly engaged in combat with Houthi fighters, sinking 3 of their boats and killing 10 men. More recently, the AP reported that a Houthi drone boat detonated within a couple of miles of a U.S. Navy vessel, and U.S. warships have shot down more than 60 Houthi missiles or drones. So there's a constant threat from the Houthis. Biden is going to has faced all kinds of demands that he hit Houthi targets in Yemen itself, which I suspect he's hesitant to do because no one wants to reignite the war within Yemen, the one that was the ceasefire is like a couple of years old. It's pretty fragile. So understandable there. But there's also been at least 120 attacks against U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria since mid-October. And then on January 4th, the U.S. military killed the leader of an Iranian-backed militia group in Baghdad. So obviously Iraqi officials were not thrilled about that violation of their sovereignty. And then, Ben, on top of that, Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister of Israel, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal recently calling on the U.S. and Israel to take on Iran directly in a regime change operation. What could go wrong there? And then, oh, by the way, Ben, Iran has drastically ramped up its uranium enrichment work and now has the fuel for at least 3 atomic weapons. So there's just like all these fuses slowly burning out there.
Yeah.
And I'm just waiting for one of them to light.
Now, that's the right image. And we said back in October that the longer this war went on, the more the risks of escalation went up. And that's exactly what's happened. And just to take a few of them and what people should be watching for, like with the Houthis and what's happening in the Red Sea, I do think it is entirely understandable and appropriate that the U.S. and a bunch of other countries, because the U.S. is working with a bunch of European countries essentially, to try to protect what's called freedom of navigation in the Red Sea. This basically means that what the Houthis are trying to do is disrupt the flow of commerce, the flow of ships and container ships and commerce through the Red Sea. And the idea that you would escort ships and that you would try to like push back, Houthi attack boats and things, that kind of falls within both an internationally legally accepted and also just kind of a U.S. approach to the world. So that's part of what we do.
Do you hear what they named it? Operation Prosperity Guardian. These Pentagon names, man.
Yeah. Operation Capitalism, Operation Late Stage Capitalism proceeds in the Red Sea. So, but I think what people should watch for, and you put your finger on it, is I do not think that should include the striking of Houthi targets in Yemen. That's a different thing.
Under what authority, by the way?
That's a major escalation,
Mm-hmm.
And you might say to me, well, like the command and control is back in Yemen. Of course it is. But are you telling me if this Saudi-led war in Yemen for years, basically the more they bombed Yemen, the more resilient the Houthis became? We're not going to destroy the Houthis in Yemen. We have no legal basis to be doing that. And so I think that the U.S. and the U.K., who's been rumored to be a part of this or said that they might be a part of it, should not be doing that. This should be about, if this is about protecting ships going through the Red Sea, Operation Capitalism, maybe that's one thing. But if this is about like we're going to go after the Houthis in Yemen, I think that's a dangerous escalation. In Lebanon, where we've seen this uptick, the thing I'd be looking for is you saw these Israeli strikes into Beirut against Hamas leadership. The more this goes into Beirut, the more likely it is that the Hezbollah response escalates. We've said before, Hezbollah has many, many tens of thousands of advanced rockets. If this is going into Beirut or if this is going against Hezbollah leadership, that's when this thing that's the fuse that could blow there.
I forgot to even include that one. There were so many. I forgot the fucking Israeli drone strike in Beirut.
Yeah, that's right. So the fuse that is burning down in the Red Sea is attacks on the Houthis in Yemen. The fuse that is burning down in Lebanon is these attacks into Beirut. The fuse that is burning down in Iraq, the U.S. has obviously been taking military action as part of its ISIS campaign in parts of Iraq for a while. Baghdad is usually not a place where the U.S. takes military action. So I'd have to be persuaded why that was necessary. Because
it was like central Baghdad.
Because essentially, too, like, what is the price we're willing to pay? Are we willing to basically sever our relationship with the Iraqi government because of the Israeli war in Gaza? Because we're now part of this. This is where you start to feel like we're on these variety of different slippery slopes: Iraq, Yemen, and Lebanon. And then the Iran nuclear program, it just bears, for accountability reasons, Tommy, and maybe I'll limit myself to once a month on this one. But the decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear agreement is one of the bigger catastrophes ever. Yeah. And the fact that nobody wants to talk about that because it's politically exhausting to revisit. But the reality is, if you compare where this nuclear program was in the nuclear deal and where it is now, it shows the catastrophe of that policy. If people want to say, well, the Iranians are really bad guys, this is part of I was thinking about this over the break, Tommy. This is part of what is wrong in the world right now. There's no diplomacy. It's like we can't negotiate. If you can't negotiate with your adversaries, who are you negotiating with?
Right.
We can't negotiate an end to Iran's nuclear program with Israel or with the Europeans. We can't, at some point, by the way, we can't negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine without talking to the Russians, okay? Like at some point here, if we're going to take diplomacy off the table with China, Russia, and Iran, we're going to end up in a world war. Like, I don't like where else do people see this going? You know?
This is a sort of a pre-World War I kind of conflict in the Balkans escalating.
It feels like that, and so I like there, and good for Biden, by the way, for going to meet with Xi Jinping and try to kind of put that on ice for a bit. That's the kind of thing. And look, I'm not suggesting we should be like, giving away the store here, like take the Russians. Like, I'm not suggesting we should negotiate over the heads of the Ukrainians and cut them out. Obviously, I'm not suggesting we make all manner of concessions to the Iranians, but when you foreclose diplomacy, what's left? And right now what we're seeing is not a lot of diplomacy other than kind of trying to put out fires that are burning, not even put them out, just kind of fight them around the margins here. Like at a certain point, we have to decide whether we're comfortable living with this degree of escalation risk.
Yeah. Actually, when I was in Iowa, for some reason, Vivek Ramaswamy let me interview him. So we talked a little bit of foreign policy.
It's because we gave him so many clips on Pod
Yeah, we're getting a lot of love here. I mean, so look, he's anti-war. Some of his plans are kind of like fantasy land, right? We'll negotiate a deal where we break the Russian and Chinese military lines. He did come out pretty hard in favor of, he's opposed to extending additional military aid to Israel in the midst of this war, which is interesting. I said to him, I was like, I'm surprised given your stances on being anti-war generally that you weren't for the Iranian nuclear deal. And he's like, well, it was just so poorly executed. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, do you really trust the IAEA to monitor these things?
Yeah,
like, yes,
I do. I entirely trust the IAEA to monitor these things. I want to ask you.
And if not, like, it's nihilism. Like, what do we trust?
Well, and I want to ask you about the politics in this, Tommy, because like you're an Iowan, obviously like cover politics more than I do. But the couple things I see are, one, weirdly, like Trump is going to be running as this anti-war candidate, and this is chaos to Joe Biden. And there's, I don't like the America First isolationism root of that, because that's like the anti-war of the 30s, like the kind of, but I do think it's a mistake to assume that Americans support these policies everywhere. The Americans support a war with Iran and war across the Middle East and kind of like a open-ended war in Ukraine. Like, you have to be able to at least explain why you're trying to end the wars or how you're trying to end the wars. That's the first thing I'd be interested in what you think about. And then the second thing is on the politics in the Democratic Party, to go back to the Bernie clip. I remember in 2012 when Obama was running for re-election, I was the NSC person who traveled with him the last kind of month or so. And our best events were all on like college campuses. It was like Madison, Wisconsin. And that's where Democrats go out and get the vote out, right? Is Joe Biden going to be able to do that, without mass protests everywhere he goes? I'm not talking about like just interrupting a speech like we saw in South Carolina the other day. I'm talking about like, could Joe Biden today go to the University of Wisconsin in Madison and not have like a pretty sizable protest?
Today, no. I think that, whether or not he could go to that same group in 6 months really depends on where this war is.
Yeah,
but today,
exactly.
no. From observing some of the Republican events, one of Trump's bigger applause lines is, or even when his surrogates say it, is he's the only president in recent history who hasn't gotten us into a war. And they love that.
Yeah.
So that he gets credit for that, despite the fact that he was the one who assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So we were like,
he planted all the seeds for this current proxy.
And there was a massive Iranian response.
Yeah.
And just because of luck, no American service members were killed and it didn't escalate. But he does get a lot of credit for that. He also, interestingly, he has not been out front talking much about what's happening in Israel, because I think he knows there is a broader risk of escalation here, but he also wants to be seen as the guy who did everything for Bibi to get the evangelical votes.
Yeah. But again, pulling out the Iran deal, assassinating Qasem Soleimani, moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, annexing, recognizing annexation, all this stuff. I don't think October 7th happens without all that stuff. In the same way that, pulling the rug out from under the Ukrainians, he planted a lot of seeds here, but that's a complicated argument to make.
Yeah. Well,
so I think if Biden, the best thing you can do if you're Biden is not have this be a war in a few months. But even with Ukraine, being able to tell a story about how, not just why it's necessary to kind of be involved in these wars, but why and how you're going to end them. I think that's something that has to be developed over the next 10 months.
Listen, the U.S. government could respond to all of these escalation risks as one-offs, or we could see them for what they are, which is tied to what's happening in Gaza right now.
Yeah.
Right? The Houthis say they're going to keep firing at ships until sufficient humanitarian relief is getting into Gaza and the war ends. I'm not saying that they're like good guys or that's sort of they have good intentions, but that's their stated goal here. Similar with Hezbollah, like the Israelis and Hezbollah have been involved in, on again, off again shooting war for many, many years, but things have escalated since October 7th. I think one way to de-escalate them would be for what's happening in Gaza to de-escalate. So a lot of these fires are burning. I mean, it's certainly not Israel's fault that they were attacked by Hamas on October 7th, but I do think that cooling that off and calling it a ceasefire there, getting back into good negotiations to get hostages out would be one way to chill out everything in the region. Yeah. Also, I mean, there was a massive ISIS terrorist attack in southern Iran a couple days ago at an event commemorating the 4th anniversary of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, who, again, Trump ordered killed in, was that early 2020? Yeah. So but a lot of weird things happening.
That goes to first of all, that goes to show a couple of things. First of all, when there's this kind of escalation and there's a fire burning across the region, all the arsonists come out to play, right? And so the fact that ISIS is like, now's the time to do this kind of thing shows how unpredictable escalation is. And it actually proves your point about it's not Israel's fault in any way, shape, or form that for what Hamas did on October 7th. But just as you're like, well, Hezbollah is, or the Houthis, let's say, are being opportunistic and taking advantage of that. I don't like ISIS, like just because they attacked Iran doesn't mean I think that you end up with the wrong bedfellows,
right?
Yeah. And like ISIS is attacking Iran, it's like, well,
enemy of the enemy is not your friend.
Yeah, that's exactly my point.
Yeah. Well, last thought on this. I know we're going long today, but we've been off for a while and we have a lot to say. Yeah. There is a place for everyone listening to do some advocacy. Call your members of Congress, call your senators, tell them you want to see a ceasefire, tell them you want future aid to Israel conditioned, tell them you want negotiations to get hostages back, tell them that you're worried about the humanitarian toll. I mean, they will listen to a whole bunch of people calling. Call the White House as well. Weigh in, let them know.
Yeah. I mean, Democrats changing their positions, as we've seen, is a really important message to the White House and to the world about the fact that the United States is not comfortable with the current direction of the Israeli government's policy.
Yeah, period. Okay, Ben, weirdest story of the week is definitely Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's health issues and non-disclosure of them. So here's what we know. On December 22nd, Secretary Austin had what was described as an elective procedure. Right before we started recording, the Pentagon announced it was a procedure to treat prostate cancer. So wishing him the best. Hopefully that is all cured because it's obviously very scary. On January 1st, Secretary Austin had to be taken by ambulance to Walter Reed Military Medical Center after experiencing complications from the treatment, including nausea and severe pain. On January 2nd, Austin transferred to his deputy, Kathleen Hicks, quote, operational responsibilities that require constant secure communications capabilities. So he transferred to his deputy some sort of some of his job requirements, but didn't tell her that he had been hospitalized. She was on vacation in Puerto Rico at the time. On January 4th, the Pentagon told both the White House and Deputy Secretary Hicks about Austin's medical issues. And then on January 5th, it all became public. So we should say up front that Secretary Austin's Chief of Staff, Kelly Magsman, is a good friend of ours. We all work together at the Obama White House. There's some reporting coming out that says maybe the Pentagon was slow in notifying the White House because Kelly was out sick. But I would just like to point out that nearly 30,000 people work at the Pentagon.
Yeah. It's been a lot on Kelly's shoulders.
Yeah, so, I find it hard to believe that only Kelly had the White House switchboard number. Yeah. Regardless, if any organization is stiff enough to create a huge PR problem for itself by being too rigid about who informs who or who calls whom over at the White House, it would be the Pentagon, but whatever. Regardless, earlier today, the White House Chief of Staff ordered cabinet secretaries to evaluate their procedures for delegating authority, and Jeff Zients clarified how and when the White House should be notified. Should also point out that the Pentagon says Secretary Austin never lost consciousness and never underwent general anesthesia. So he was conscious the whole time he was at Walter Reed. Ben, what the hell do you make of this weird story? We know more today than we did yesterday, but how big a deal do you think this is?
I mean, it's a very strange story. And we, again, like you said, we learned what the underlying condition was today, which is a very serious condition. I think as a human being, I can feel a great deal of sympathy and empathy for Lloyd Austin, both because of the health issues going for, and also because like your first impulse when you have a surgery to deal with prostate cancer and then have complications is probably not to put out a press release, right?
No.
That said, no offense to Tom Vilsack, but like this is not the Secretary of Agriculture, and that's actually why I don't think.
Shot at Iowa. I just got back.
This is why I don't think the whole cabinet reviewing its procedures is the point here. There's the Secretary of Defense is different.
You're not going to commerce emergency?
Yeah, like if you are signed up to be the Secretary of Defense of the United States and you're commanding the most powerful military in the world, and you're the person that the President of the United States is going to have to consult about an escalation into a new crisis or, God forbid, some nuclear incident, like there just needs to be notification if you're going to be off the grid at all. I mean, shit, when I was in the White House, if I, was going out of town for the weekend, I had to tell somebody,
Right.
And what is kind of mystifying to me about this is that the procedures, like there was a strike in Baghdad, we've already talked about, on January 4th, which again was a pretty dramatic thing for the U.S. to do. It was a strike in Baghdad. We don't usually do that. The way that would go, something like that, when I was in government, is if we became aware that was going to happen, even if we'd already had meetings about it, there'd be like a secure conference call. It'd be like everybody would have to get on the yellow phone, and the Secretary of Defense would be on too. And it's kind of strange to me that, and again, the holidays are a bit of a different time. Mm-hmm. So it may be that this wouldn't have I think that's part of the story here, frankly, because it's the only time of the year that people kind of shut down. But so I don't think this would happen, say, this week, but it is the reason it doesn't make sense, or the reason it shouldn't have happened that way, is that, what if someone really had to get the Secretary of Defense on a secure phone and couldn't, who was getting on the call around that January 4th strike? I mean, and again, this is not to impugn sometimes stuff slips through the cracks, and right. I could totally see that, like, maybe Secretary Austin was sick and obviously otherwise engaged. Maybe Kelly then was sick, and so just someone. And
Deputy Hicks was in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, someone forgot to call, or someone didn't know who it may just be as simple as they didn't mean to hide it. It just, like, everybody was sick or out of pocket, and so therefore the normal notifications didn't happen. And that may have been a symptom of it being the holidays. And I think you have to remember these are human beings in government. That kind of shit happens. But I do think it's worth going back and looking at, again, not to take a shot at Tom Vilsack, but not in every cabinet department. It really is different if it's the Defense Department.
Totally. I mean, I think if this story was just that he was in the hospital for a few days and they didn't tell the press, that would be bad, but not totally surprising for the U.S. government. Yeah. The fact that no one told the White House
or the Deputy Secretary of Defense
for several days, that's what makes it so weird. It sounds like, look, I don't know Secretary Austin. By all accounts, he's not only very good at the job, but a really good guy.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
He sounds like he's incredibly private. I could imagine if you were having prostate surgery, that if you were one of his underlings, you'd be scared shitless about telling people about his personal medical procedure and issues, and maybe that's where this comes from. But yeah, mistakes were made.
Yeah, mistakes. I think it's a combination of that, the holidays, just a lot of stuff probably happened that made this happen.
Trump's former Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, was on TV over the weekend saying that Trump's a threat to democracy. So it could be worse.
Yeah, it could be a lot. And look, I don't think this is something you fire Lloyd Austin over. I do think it's something you go back and you're like, okay, we need a protocol. If someone's going to the ICU, if somebody's, not reachable, like there needs to be a notification system that is not just hoping that Kelly picked up the phone because maybe Kelly was sick,
Yeah. We should probably just, know where the guy is at all times.
Yeah.
Ben, two big updates on foreign corruption in U.S. politics. So first, House Democrats released evidence that Donald Trump took in at least $7.8 million from foreign entities when he was in office. That includes $5.5 million from Chinese entities. Remember the emoluments clause? Remember that was a thing? Talk about a massive opposition research gift for, anyone running against him. Feel free to run with that, guys. Second, New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez is facing more allegations of corruption. This comes from a superseding indictment filed by prosecutors in New York last week, who alleged that Bob Menendez made positive comments about Qatar in exchange for luxury items, including watches ranging between $10,000 and $24,000 in value. Previously, Menendez was accused of accepting bribes from a New Jersey businessman with ties to Egypt's intelligence services, including getting gold bars, as one does. The indictment then has this Menendez confidant, co-defendant now, texting him to say, quote, "How about one of these?" along with photos of said expensive watches. Again, very subtle, Bob. What do you make of Menendez allegedly getting bribes from both the Egyptian and Qatari government? Those aren't governments that are necessarily friendly.
No, those are governments that hate each other. I mean, like the Egyptians absolutely despise the Qataris. I mean, which again shows you that Bob Menendez was literally for sale. I mean, you know, this wasn't some ideological affinity he had. Not that would have made it better, but it's just he was for sale at a time when he was the fucking chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Like, and again,
it's wild.
Like Democrats, like we just heard about Trump. Trump is like corrupt as all hell and in much bigger danger because obviously was president, wants to be president again. But why is Bob Menendez still in the Foreign Relations Committee?
Get him out of there.
Get him off that committee. This is ridiculous. This is absurd, you know? This guy is entirely corrupt, and that's been evident for a long time. Once again, we have a pretty good record on this podcast. You may not agree with all of our affirmative beliefs, but our list of villains, like since the beginning of this podcast, has basically been Bibi Netanyahu, Bob Menendez, Jared Kushner, Boris Johnson. Like Bin
Laden.
We don't like Bin Laden.
Like that guy.
Okay, we don't like fucking Bin Laden.
I'm on TikTok, but I do not like him.
Been very clear about Bin Laden where we stand. I feel pretty good about this, but Bob Menendez should not be on that committee. And if people want to look for someone to feel better about in politics, our friend Andy Kim, who's running against Bob Menendez, doing a great service. Support that guy, please. Just let's get past the Menendez era.
Two other things in the Trump piece. So the House Democrats based this report off of documents they got from Trump's accounting firm after a long legal battle. But when the House Republicans took over, they killed the investigation. So these figures are based on like 1% of Trump's businesses. So the real number is probably way bigger. Also, did you see that? So Trump's got this sort of novel legal theory that he's immune from all prosecution because he was impeached
he wasn't,
and wasn't removed. The judge in one of Trump's that case today asked if a president of the United States could order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival and still have immunity, and Trump's lawyers said yes. So that's his official position.
That's what they seem to believe here.
What if he killed everyone in the Senate so they couldn't vote?
I mean, unfortunately, like these are not like hypotheticals.
Hugh Hewitt would defend it.
Yeah. Hugh Hewitt,
Wall Street Journal head.
Well, it just the way they're contorting themselves on these legal theories is actually scary because they're taking like formal positions that this should be the law, and he's running to be in charge of the U.S. government, including the Justice Department. So we should take it seriously while chuckling about it. Because it's fucking crazy. And also it's like total projection on the foreign stuff because like they're twisting themselves in knots to try to prove that because Hunter Biden did some business in China, Joe Biden's corrupt, when Donald Trump is taking all this money from fucking China.
And Jared Kushner. $2 billion from the Saudis.
Which is, again, why Democrats are now be hard on Democrats too. Like the investigations of Jared Kushner that have not taken place are a disappointment. You know, like
big time.
These guys have been literally giving Hunter Biden a proctology exam for years when Jared Kushner was actually an employed senior advisor of the White House, drumming up business for his multi-billion-dollar payout on the back end.
Yep.
I'd like to know more about that.
I would too. Ben, let's do an update on things in Russia and Ukraine, where unfortunately there have not been any positive developments in the last few weeks as we get to the 2-year mark of the war. So the winter is setting in. It's bitterly cold. Russia is on the offensive, and they've been bombarding cities with missiles to wear down civilians and civilian infrastructure with almost daily casualties. Additionally, Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines say that Russia started using glide bombs, which are released from planes and smashed through these underground bunkers, so they're very effective and lethal. The British Defense Ministry said this week that the Russian military is on course to lose 500,000 personnel within the next year. The MOD tweeted, quote, "The average daily number of Russian casualties in Ukraine has risen by almost 300 during the course of 2023. If the numbers continue at the current rate over the next year, Russia will have lost over 500,000 personnel in Ukraine." So just a staggering amount of loss. Russia is also getting a ton of help from North Korea. In November, South Korea's intelligence services briefed members of parliament there that North Korea had already shipped Russia 1 million artillery shells. That is far more than the European Union has supplied to the Ukrainian military. Russia is also using North Korean ballistic missiles, and the Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. officials believe Russia is planning to buy missiles from Iran as well, ballistic missiles. Over the break, there was a story in Politico that said the U.S. and Europe are shifting from a strategy of total victory over Russia to one geared towards improving Ukraine's leverage in an eventual negotiation to end the war. The White House denies that there's any change in administration policy, but I mean, I after the counteroffensive kind of stalled, I find it hard to believe that anyone is on board with the stated Ukrainian goal of taking back all of eastern Ukraine and all of Crimea. I wonder at some point whether the administration will feel the need to be more public about their actual goals for this war.
I think so. And I mean, I think everybody knows it. It's like an elephant in the room. I mean, I don't expect Zelensky to change that position because he can't so long as we, the problem for Zelensky is we have heard reports of how Ukrainians are treated in occupied territories, children being kidnapped. And he can't come out and say, right, fine. But at the end of the day, it's also the case that we can't see a pathway to Ukraine taking that territory militarily. Now, I just, as a matter of practicality, despite supporting diplomacy, as I said, and I don't think any settlement is likely anyway before our election because Putin's going to try to wait out the election too. But I do think you have to start to be thinking and testing and having conversations with the Europeans and the Ukrainians and maybe in back channels with the Russians about some pathway of de-escalation. Now, I also think that Putin, is good at projecting like everything is going great for him, but that casualty number, it took 10 years for the war in Afghanistan to kind of help collapse the Soviet Union. The longer these casualty numbers, sink in, and the more they have impacts back in communities, it usually takes some time for that to have an impact politically. So I don't think we should underestimate the fact that like Putin is going to have some challenges in Russia for a long time now because of this. There's also been a brain drain that they're going to have to deal with. The last thing I just wanted, ruminating over the break, probably, unfortunately not about positive things because the world doesn't seem that great. This North Korea piece, there were some like North Korean escalations, provocations towards the South Koreans over the break. Who knows what they're getting from the Russians in exchange for all this artillery? They must be getting something. Mm-hmm. And the thing I was thinking about is, okay, the world's on fire, and the thing we talk about, a lot of people talk about is like you got Ukraine, you got the Middle East, and then you got Taiwan. Like, hey, let's not forget the Korean Peninsula here. Because if Trump wins, okay, do you think that the U.S. would come to the defense of South Korea in a Trump administration?
I haven't even thought about it.
This is a man that literally, I haven't thought about it either until for some reason I thought about this over the break, but like, this is a man who has love letters from Kim Jong-un like displayed on his wall.
Thinks it's a big accomplishment.
Boasts about how tight he is with the guy. You've got Kim Jong-un clearly feeling emboldened by the support he's getting from Russia and China. I don't know. I watched that one. It's another reason for Trump not to win because I kind of feel like suddenly the Korean Peninsula becomes a hot spot again.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. I mean, it's easy to mock North Korea as sort of a backward Potemkin cult of personality, but they have a military-industrial complex that is...
That's all they are.
Churns,
the
right?
whole state is a military-industrial
they got a lot
complex.
of shells they can transfer over. And also, in the United States, there's still this big question about this supplemental funding bill and frankly, the entire fate of the Ukrainian war effort probably rides on it. So
we'll see. A lot up in the air in 2024.
Have you been tracking the almost naked party controversy in Russia?
Very close, actually.
Okay, for listeners at home, over the holidays, TV presenter and blogger with like 18 million followers, a younger woman, threw a party with a theme almost naked. The guest list was this who's who of Russian socialites and celebrities, and they were, of course, everyone was posting it on social media, and the pictures and videos went up online, and everybody was, as one might expect, almost naked per the theme. A bunch of ultra-conservative media figures saw these photos, flipped their shit, started arguing the country's at war and that this behavior from elites is unacceptable. So now you got the host getting sued. There was a rapper who attended who wore only a sock where you might expect he would wear it. He was thrown in jail for 15 days under the new anti-LGBT laws. So I do think, I was talking to Alon about this, it's a signal that everyone, even these rich elites in Moscow who can feel, safe, are now, they can't escape the hard right, ultra-conservative pivot that is happening in Russia.
It's hard being a Russian oligarch or influencer these days,
Yeah,
Tommy. You can't go to an almost naked party and post the pictures on Instagram and not have a backlash. I mean, to me, what it shows is the ultra-conservative thing, but it also shows somebody in the Kremlin, maybe Putin himself, recognizing that the kind of Marie Antoinette, like late regime, let them eat cake vibe of, we've got hundreds of thousands of casualties out in the provinces, but the Moscow elite is still partying with like vodka and caviar and socks in certain places, is like, that's probably not the content you want available to Russians who've lost loved ones on the front lines. Because let me tell you who's not fighting the war in Ukraine: the children of Moscow oligarchs or the influencers who are at the almost naked party.
This was Alexei Navalny's genius.
Yes.
Because his organization would fly drones over the various, Russian officials' chateaus in Bordeaux or whatever, and post long YouTubes of, Putin's $500 million house that he just built on the ocean, et cetera, and show this kleptocracy that was pervasive.
In like one of the only countries in the world that had a successful revolution against like a kleptocratic oligarchic elite. So it's, only 100 years ago that, the Tsar ended up with his head cut off here. And, we can laugh about the almost naked party, but like that's the kind of stuff that leads to people with pitchforks.
Yes, that's true. So we just recently celebrated the anniversary of January 6th. Happy anniversary. Thank you. Yep. So, political violence is front and center.
Do you celebrate on January 6th Eve or on January 6th?
On January 6th proper, we do. We break one window on the 5th.
Yeah.
Just to
get a mood.
Get us going. Punch through a neighbor's window. But we did want to, changing tones, we did want to flag this scary story out of South Korea, because on January 2nd, an opposition leader named Lee Jae-myung was stabbed in the neck during a campaign event. So this is the opposition leader of the Liberal Democratic Party. This was not the first politically motivated knife attack in South Korea. In 2006, the future president, President Park, was slashed in the face at a rally by one of her critics. And in 2015, our friend Mark Lippert, who at the time was the U.S. ambassador to South Korea,
great guy,
was slashed in the face at a public event by this anti-American nationalist lunatic. Neighboring Japan has dealt with scary political violence recently. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was assassinated in July of 2022. Then in September of last year, a man threw a pipe bomb at Prime Minister Kishida at a campaign event. That was another close call. So look, the Secret Service's record here in the U.S. is spotty at best, I would say, but there's a lot of infrastructure to protect U.S. presidents. But having just gotten back from Iowa, Ben, you are reminded of how unbelievably vulnerable candidates are.
Yeah.
I shook Ron DeSantis' hand. I bet he regrets that.
You did?
Yeah. It was weird. Was
it slippery, or was it kind of...
it was just waxy. His full face.
Well, did it feel like a human hand, or
It was me, Lacey, and Caroline Dunphy, who I think you probably know a little bit, who does the hilarious videos here. So we go to the event. He sort of goes into the crowd, and we go up to see if we can record him and talking to voters. And I'm trying to back away into the corner, right? Because the staffer in me feels uncomfortable, and also I don't want them to clock me and not let us into any other events in the future. Dunphy has no anxieties about any of this, and basically,
I admire people like that, because I'm not like that. I'm very self-aware.
As I back away, she basically is like, "Hey, idiot," and tosses me her phone, and I get a little selfie of her with him, which is great. But he did the smile, and she tried to mimic it, and it was very funny. But anyway, political violence is bad.
Political violence is bad, and it is there's an uptick in this stuff. And again, the more, the serious point, I think, is the more people everywhere, not just in this country, are being radicalized by conspiracy theory and grievance because of online cesspools of information, the more there's going to happen, because people get more and more worked up. And
Brazil just had their insurrection first anniversary too.
Yeah, but they dealt with theirs.
They're dealing with theirs.
They're dealing with theirs a little better than ours. Yeah.
Two other quick things. One, I just want to flag that farmers in Germany are staging a week-long protest this week against the government's plan to phase out tax breaks on diesel fuel used in agriculture. You might be wondering, why do I care about this? Because it's kind of interesting. So Chancellor Olaf Scholz proposed this plan last week because he has to close an $18 billion gap in their 2024 budget that was left after Germany's constitutional court ruled the government cannot repurpose emergency COVID relief funds to use for programs to combat climate change. So Scholz's government has been scrambling to figure out how to close that budget gap because they have strict legal limits on how much debt Germany can rack up. The constitutional limits are 0.35% of economic output. It's a debt limit put in place after the 2008 financial crisis. This is the big fight we had with the Germans, austerity versus stimulus, blah, blah, blah. But it's interesting because the far right in Germany has been doing well in local elections, and now they are using this strike and the anger over these subsidies for political advantage. They're saying they support the protesters, and they're saying they would expand the subsidies for farmers and trying to sort of become, sort of a Trumpian move to try to become the party that backs the farmers in this sort of populist way. So something to watch here.
Yeah, it's interesting because one, it shows the difficult politics of climate change. People don't like the trade-offs. Two, we see this kind of rise of the AfD, the far-right party in Germany, and like you're saying, trying to align themselves with a seemingly left position. And then look, whenever you have the far right in Germany saying that they're the ones that can keep the trains running on time, that's not worth it. Okay, guys? Like, it's just not something we want.
Well said. 2023 was also the hottest year on record, so we should probably not stop these efforts to prevent climate change. Last thing, French President Emmanuel Macron appointed a 34-year-old named Gabriel Attal to be his new prime minister. 34 years old. Attal previously served as education minister and was the government's spokesperson during the pandemic. He is the first openly gay prime minister in French history. And it seems like all of this is Macron looking for a political boost ahead of the European parliamentary elections this spring. And also, like, probably someone to take his place once he's term limited out.
I was going to say what's interesting, Macron's been pretty shaky political ground, but there's been a kind of guessing game as to who might be his, like, anointed successor. And that doesn't mean that it's necessarily this guy for sure. But, that if the German election is one to watch because you don't want to see the rise of the far right, the French election, similarly, the question is going to be who's going to basically be against Marine Le Pen. And this guy now enters the conversation.
Yeah, he's got some riz.
Yeah.
He seems cool.
Yeah, he seems
cool. But,
guy.
there's a good chance we wake up in some period of time, a year or two, I don't really remember when all the elections are, and we see the AfD or Marine Le Pen's party in charge. The trajectory feels a little scary there.
It's a little scary. I mean, the AfD, like, in charge seems like far away, but, like, I don't know, like, I just, the far right in Germany is just, nobody wants that.
No.
It's just like, if ever there's a place where we don't want that.
If we can stop at one place,
I'd say
it'd be good to pick Germany.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, you'll hear Ben's conversation with Emily Wu about the upcoming elections in Taiwan, so stick around for that. Pod Save the World is brought to you by ZipRecruiter. According to Forbes, January is the hottest month for hiring, and business owners and hiring managers are on the hunt for top talent, which is no easy task. If you're currently hiring, you can probably relate. It's challenging to find qualified candidates. That's why you need ZipRecruiter. ZipRecruiter's powerful matching technology finds the right people for your roles fast, and right now you could try it for free at ZipRecruiter.com/pod. How is ZipRecruiter so effective at finding top talent? Immediately after you post your job, ZipRecruiter's smart technology starts showing you candidates whose skills and experience match it. And to encourage top candidates to respond to your job post even sooner, ZipRecruiter lets you send them a personal invite to apply. This month, find the talent you need to fill all of your roles with ZipRecruiter. See for yourself why 4 out of 5 employees who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. Just go to this exclusive web address right now to try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/pod. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/pod, P-O-D. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
On January 13th, that's Saturday, Taiwan is going to be holding presidential and legislative elections, a country of 23 million people, having an election, of course, with the question not only of what the people of Taiwan want, but obviously questions related to the role of China and what it wants, questions around global security and stability. So no matter who Taiwan's people choose to replace the outgoing president Tsai Ing-wen from the Democratic Progressive Party, we know that obviously a lot is at stake for the future of the people of Taiwan, but also for the future of the world. Luckily for us, we have today as our guest Emily Wu, who is a Taiwanese journalist, a podcast host, the founder of Ghost Island Media, and someone that I've really learned a lot from about Taiwan over the last couple of years. So, Emily, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's a real pleasure to be here. Love your show. I tell a lot of people about your show, and thank you.
Well, I will say at the beginning, for people who want to go deeper, check out Ghost Island Media Pods because they're really awesome. They're kind of the crooked media of Taiwan. So, Emily, I just want to start by asking you, for people, listeners who may may not have been following this. Can you just describe to us the current state of the election and kind of what the vibe is around voting coming up this weekend?
Yeah, so every presidential election has been really major in Taiwan, all for very different reasons, right? Going back to 1996, when we had our first direct presidential election, that was momentous on its own. The next one in 2000s, it was the first time that a non-KMT person would possibly be a president. That was momentous. 2008, when the KMT might take the presidential office back again, that was momentous on its own. And because every time, every political party in Taiwan, there's very different. Everybody has a lot of different domestic views on domestic policies, but really where they come down to, the greatest differences come down to the relations with China. And this time around, we've had 8 years of Taiwan where we've seen really good international, I think, development in Taiwan. We've come out of COVID quite well, but geopolitics has changed so much that for the world looking in Taiwan, but also in Taiwan, I mean, every open election is so different, but this time around we have a third party that is quite strong. That's been very interesting. And we don't know, it's quite up to a couple of days ago when the polls ended, there's a polling blackout in Taiwan 10 days prior to the election. Up to then, polls tell us one thing, but we just don't know. And so people are nervous, but people are telling everybody to get out to the vote. Campaigns are happening. It's really heated up, and we're really just looking forward to Saturday.
So you indicated a bunch of things that I think I'll give quick context and lead into a question with this. I mean, the relatively new nature of Taiwan being a democracy, right? Because for decades under the KMT, it was kind of single-party autocratic rule until the late 90s. Then this question of relations with China, the KMT, ironically, because they were the ones that lost the civil war with the Chinese Communist Party, but they've become the party that favors better ties with the mainland. The DPP, which has been the party of Tsai Ing-wen, has been the party that has been more de facto, we're our own country, less willing to negotiate around a one China formula. I want to get at a couple questions here, but just starting with, I think the front runner in most of those polls has been William Lai, who's the vice president to Tsai Ing-wen, but has generally usually been seen as a little bit more, at least the perception I can say from the U.S., is that Tsai Ing-wen is a little more pragmatic, a little more cautious. William Lai had described himself in the past as being a pragmatic, pro-independence kind of politician. He's moderated that formula a bit in this election campaign. What are the perceptions of William Lai, and how do you assess the relative strength of his candidacy versus the other two parties as we head in the home stretch?
For William Lai, I mean, it really looks like it would be a continuation of what Taiwan has looked like in the past 8 years in terms of foreign policy, in terms of internationally. Actually, the fact that all the candidates have said that they would continue foreign policy as it exists today, but they come down to detailed differences to what relations with China or relations with the U.S. would be. But on the most part, the continuation of Taiwan's involvement in the world, engagement in the world. But for the DPP, it looks like as it is now, and that means really also warming ties with the U.S. But that also means that China would continue its aggression on Taiwan because China does see DPP as quote unquote separatist. The issue of independence or status quo, William Lai has said he would continue the status quo. The status quo being the way we are now, which means it is still the country as it exists today. Is that?
Yeah, it's kind of an autonomy. I mean, basically, we don't have to declare independence because we already are our own country. So that's kind of a status quo. I mean, I guess one thing I'm interested in, So if you've got William Lai saying, I kind of want to continue Tsai Ing-wen's policy, right, closer to the United States, obviously buying a lot of arms from the United States, but not trying to not upset the status quo too much with China, not trying to be provocative. The KMT, more willing to negotiate with the Chinese, probably less inclined to kind of cozy up to the Americans. One question I have for you, though, Emily, is that how much do voters think about the China issue when they go to the polls versus I'm sure there's all manner of other domestic issues. As in any country, there's policy related to healthcare and the economy, and DPP has been pretty progressive on certain social issues like gay marriage. And do you and your friends, or your sense of the electorate, that the dominant issue is this question of relations with China and the U.S.? How much does that factor into voting versus other issues that are more domestically focused?
So when the KMT and also the TPP, the third party that's led by the former mayor of Taipei, who's now running for president, what they say is that when they say they would like to engage China, it's via what's called the 1992 consensus, which is in a way kind of Taiwan's own one China policy, which means that both China and Taiwan agree that there is one China, but there's two different definitions to that. And so the 92 consensus really to the DPP means that you are agreeing with China that Taiwan's a part of China. And so that's where the condition for engagement. So when DPP has continued to, the Tsai administration has continued to say they're really welcome to engagement with China, but under the condition that this is on equal parts, Taiwan and China. So when I think the voters are looking at how is KMT and TPP, the third party, going to get China to talk to Taiwan, that question is that what are we giving up our sovereignty? That question, I think, it comes around during every election, and I think there will be some people who say it's also split. It's on the one hand, polls will tell us that Taiwan, most people want to continue the status quo. On the other hand, when it comes to election issues, there is housing is an issue, salary is another issue, labor, another issue. I think it's different people. Some people say, well, let's see what happens this time around with more engagement with China. Others will say, we cannot allow that to happen. It's really split.
Yeah,
and we'll see on Saturday.
Is there a sense? I mean, so again, as you've sketched this out, right? Like the DPP, that's Tsai Ing-wen's party, the current president William Lai, kind of the front runner. The other two parties, KMT and TPP, more willing to engage in this one China policy. Which again, so listeners understand. Part of what's peculiar about this is that, like, say, the KMT, right? This is the party that lost the Civil War and fled with Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan. Part of the reason why they accept the one China policy is that they kind of believe that they're still the government of China, which, is rooted in a lot of history. I guess the question I can see is that, okay, if I'm imagining what it's like to be Taiwanese, and I obviously can't put myself fully in your shoes, on the one hand, I can see that, well, wait a second, I can't accept one China as a basis for negotiations because we've seen in Hong Kong that if you accept a kind of one country, two systems type formula, in the long run, you get swallowed up by China. So that's scary to me. But on the other hand, you could look at a William Lai and say, well, I'm scared that if he wins the election, that might provoke China and that might make it more likely that they continue military provocations, continue squeezing China. I mean, what is that balance of risk, right? There's the risk of engaging with China in a one China negotiation that kind of loses sovereignty. On the other hand, there's the risk of not engaging China and there having to be a provocation. I mean, when you're talking to your friends, when you're talking to other people who are, thinking about how to vote, how do you see that risk calculation happening?
Yeah, well, that talk on war and peace, whether, that risk that you just laid out, that if you vote for one particular party, it means that that's provoking China. There's a lot of that talk happening here. Political parties point at each other, candidates pointing at each other to do that, to say that. I think that there is a lot of talks on that risk, but at the end of the day, that we just need to remember that we need to all stand together, because who we are against are not each other when it comes to threat from China, right? And one of the presidential candidates, I think, and others have reminded each other that it is China that has the attack of Taiwan on its policy, and that when it comes to elections like this, yes, let's talk about the domestic issues. Let's talk about what they're trying to do, the different policies internationally.
Yeah.
I think I kind of ran into this too during when China did its live drill after Pelosi left. Is that that a lot of it is that it's this show of force, this threat, and for Taiwan, it's been, for as long as I can remember, there's always been the threat of missiles and the threat of China attacking. And, would it happen? Could it happen? You don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
And that threat is really scary, right? Yeah, right. And like, growing up, you kind of you joked about it, because that's just something that would probably never happen, because why would people wage a war against you? That's such a scary thing to think that it could be real. But you get older, you realize, just as a person, you realize how much you have in this country and how good it is, and the threat of that, any thought of losing that is a really scary feeling. So I think this is why I'm struggling so much with that question. I think that during this election, there has been a lot of that talk on war and peace. It just as one part of the election. This isn't the entire election, but it is one you see a lot. I mean, there's a campaign car for one of the smaller parties, very pro-China conservative party. The campaign car just says "peace across the street." A lot of election posters say "peace across the street," and these are for KMT parties. And the slogans for DPP is democracy, holding democracy. And so it's in one way framed as the election of war and peace versus democracy or autocracy. But the thing is, we just have to remember that it is not whichever political parties we will continue to exercise our democracy and ask for peace. And it is, at the end of the day, it is China that has the power to attack should they want to, when disregard of who's in power.
Yeah, well, I think you said it well there. And I guess another question I have related to that is, what has been your experience in this election of Chinese kind of information campaigns or influence campaigns? When I was in Taiwan, I was struck by the volume of Chinese disinformation or misinformation, or messages saying, look at Ukraine, this could happen to you if you make the wrong choice. Is that a part of the election backdrop? I mean, do you sense, can you identify what is Chinese influence operations? Does that form part of the background noise to an election?
Disinformation is really bad here for many reasons. And I think one thing to remember is that it happens throughout the year, election or not. But during the election, it gets activated. The government's been very vigilant about it. There's a lot of fact-checking groups in Taiwan because as the government tries to be vigilant, they cannot they cannot put in regulations against disinformation in the way that crosses over the question of censorship versus free speech. So all they can do is they are, for example, last month, a guy was arrested, somebody in Taiwan who runs a online site for election meddling and for interference from China. What happened was that he supposedly ran polls, and he released 8 polls, and it turned out they were under the direction of the CCP in Fujian. So that's really major. Disinformation groups, we have multiple here since 2016, and then especially after 2018 elections and more after 2020, a lot of civil society groups who are doing the fact checking to call out for disinformation and to set the record straight. And so every day they're reporting this. I don't have the number that they are catching on a daily basis. Just as a small number or perspective, there was a survey on disinformation, on the amount of misinformation that people received just last year. This is out of election year in 2023. Around a third of people said they received this on a daily basis. It's a lot here, and sometimes it is hard to tell what's what, because sometimes it's really hard to tell. For example, another one, well, actually, I don't want to put this in the realm of disinformation, so I'll skip that. But I was going to talk about what happened yesterday with the missile alert in Taiwan.
So what happened yesterday with this missile alert in Taiwan?
Well, so it was 3 p.m. last night, all our phones went off. And it was a presidential alert, which is a very high level national alert. It goes out during earthquakes, for example. But this is the first time that we ever saw an alert that came out that said there was something that was flying overhead over Taiwan to be on alert. The problem with that, this was actually a satellite that China launched yesterday out of Sichuan. It left China and it briefly crossed over Taiwan's airspace and then left. But in the English translation for the text, it said it was a missile. And so that set off a lot of alarm bells, and it was very confusing for about an hour until the Ministry of Defense finally clarified. Immediately, the foreign minister clarified on the spot, because this happened right at the same time that he was doing a news briefing for international journalists. So he clarified it right then. This was a satellite, nothing to be worried about. But it took MND about an hour. So that was very confusing. And now there's a lot of introspection on what happened. What happened that warranted an alert in the first place, and what happened to the English, which is and the translation fail that happened. And I brought it up just only in the context because of that. There's a lot of, that instance, they can correct the information really quickly. But what happens if that was a disinformation that was coming from something or another source that we didn't have enough time to react, and that sways the election.
Yeah, well, it kind of speaks to why an election in Taiwan is a little different than anything else. I guess last question is just, on the one hand, democracy is relatively new in Taiwan and people are very proud of it, and it's a part of Taiwanese identity now. On the other hand, there's, all these extremely unusual circumstances as this alert depicts. Do you feel hopeful heading into an election? Do you feel nervous about what might happen the day after the election? And particularly young people, some people may be voting for the first time. And I know that's not easy. You have to be 20, and sometimes you have to go home to your household registration to register. But what is the sense you get, particularly among young people, about the mood? Is this a hopeful time, or is it a kind of a tense and nervous time in Taiwan, or both?
It's both. I'm hopeful. Election turnout in Taiwan is incredibly high. We have about 70%, 80% election turnout. It helps that it's on a Saturday. It's on the day off for most people. I I'm hopeful. Looking at, for example, last election when we had what seemed to be a really strong opponent who's a populist, and the election results showed us that there is hope. This is good. This is good for us. We are on the right track. Taiwan's on the right track. I am hopeful. I do believe that. I'm hopeful in the sense that I think I'm hopeful in Saturday's turnout for the election. But I think all of us are wondering what will happen after this, because we're picking president, but also the legislative, the parliament. And there is the case that there's going to be a split parliament, and which might create difficulties for the next 4 years. So that I do hope that Taiwan continues its engagement in the world that it has the last several years. The young people, you talked about young people, it's interesting. The young people are particularly energetic this time around. And I'm really curious to see what happens, because there is one talk that young people are particularly interested and love this one particular candidate, the third party candidate. That's the former mayor of Taipei. I think to the young people, the DPP has been the establishment. So they want to break out of the establishment. They don't like the establishment. Neither do they like KMT. So they are eyeing for this different party, this different person. And there's a couple of weeks ago, Taiwan ran a mock election for high schoolers. They did this last election too for the referendum, and there was a big contrast between what the high schoolers, this is like 16, 17, 18-year-olds who cannot vote yet, how they would have voted on gay marriage as opposed to the national polling, and what the nation eventually voted down against gay marriage or against a particular way of gay marriage, so the young people back then at the time voted very progressively, and the actual result was flipped at the end. To show that in the referendum, gay marriage didn't pass, so then the government created a separate law allowing for gay marriage. Anyways, that's all I'm saying is that. So the young people had very different numbers, and this time around, when they polled the high schoolers, the TPP Ko Wen-je, who was the former mayor, won 58%, and it is really shocking. But there was an anecdote that was going around. Well, it was shared by a friend of mine on Facebook they said, well, one of their sons was a part of the school that participated in this. And the son went home and said, I can't believe my classmates voted for Ke. I can't believe they voted that way. What are they thinking? And then, so the parents said, well, did you go vote? He said, no.
And
they said, well, that's why.
That's why. Well, and that's weird because the third party the DPP has been seen as a more progressive party traditionally. But what you're saying in part is that now that they've been the establishment for a while, maybe the third party that is less progressive, more open to ties with China, suddenly is an alternative, right? Which is interesting. It shows you how generations scramble. Well, look, everybody should check out Dispatch from Taiwan is going to be the new series from Ghost Island Media. It's going to break down different elements of the view from Taiwan. But Emily will look for the results like everybody else. I don't know if you want to make a prediction here, but do you have a prediction, or do we want to just wait and see what happens?
Yeah, we'll wait and see. I get my hopes.
I don't want to make a prediction for the U.S. election either, so we share that in common. But look, we await the result. We obviously hope that whatever the result is, that peace endures in Taiwan. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks again, Emily Wu, for joining the show. I don't know. Thanks, listeners, for listening, because it's fun to be back.
Thanks for coming back. Yeah.
I hope you came back. Well, we're going to check the numbers. We're going to make damn sure.
Yeah, please.
But
please
rate, review, share with your friends.
Oh, yeah, all those things.
And talk to you guys next week.
Happy New Year.